They didn't yell at me. They didn't have to. My parents' voices were calm, measured, almost rehearsed when they told me that if I didn't do the right thing, I would no longer be their daughter in any legal or financial sense. Everything I had believed was mine by blood would be redirected for her benefit. And they said it, as if it were reasonable. I sat there nodding, swallowing every word, knowing that defending myself would only confirm what they already believed about me. What they never asked was whether I had anything of my own. They never wondered how I had survived years of being invisible. And they certainly never imagined that the woman they were protecting so fiercely worked under someone who already knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of. At the time, I said nothing. I let them think I was powerless. But silence has a way of traveling farther than threats ever do. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive loudly. Sometimes it waits until everyone has already made their choice. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Drop it in the comments. And if stories about quiet endurance and late justice resonate with you, consider subscribing. You're not alone here. I grew up in a house that looked stable from the outside. A 2-story colonial in a quiet suburb, trimmed hedges a flag by the porch every summer. Neighbors waved. Teachers praised our good family. At dinner parties, my parents smiled easily, telling stories about sacrifice and values. People believed them. For a long time, I did too. Inside that house, roles were assigned early. My sister Emily was the promise. I was the adjustment. Emily was 3 years younger, but everything about her arrived first. First choice of bedrooms. First new car at 16. First college tour that involved flights instead of car rides. My parents didn't frame it as favoritism. They called it investment. Emily had potential, they said. She needed confidence. She needed support. I needed to be understanding. So I learned to be. When money was tight, I took the smaller portion without comment. When plans conflicted, mine were the ones postponed. I became skilled at making myself smaller, so the household could remain calm. If there was tension, it was never because of Emily. It was because I took things too personally, or couldn't just let things go. My father liked order. He believed families worked best when everyone knew their place. He handled the finances with the seriousness of a man guarding a vault. Accounts were in his name. Trusts were discussed in vague terms like myths you weren't supposed to question. My mother enforced harmony. She didn't argue. She smoothed. When I showed hurt, she reminded me how hard things were for everyone else. By the time I left for college, I already understood the unspoken rule: gratitude was my currency. As long as I appeared grateful, I was tolerated. I paid for most of my education through scholarships and part-time work. Emily's tuition was presented as a family achievement. My GPA hovered above 3.7, but no one asked about it. When Emily struggled during her sophomore year, my parents flew out twice in 1 month. When I struggled, I learned to call less. After graduation, I moved 3 states away for work, not because I was chasing ambition, but because distance was the only way I knew how to breathe. I told my parents it was temporary. They nodded, relieved. Emily stayed close. She always did. Years passed. Emily's career unfolded the way my parents had imagined it would. She joined a well-known firm, then another, then finally landed a position that made my father proud in a way I had never seen directed at me. Her salary became a topic at family gatherings. Her bonuses were spoken of as proof that the family had done something right. Whenever I visited, I noticed how the conversation subtly bent toward her. Her challenges were discussed at length. Her frustrations were taken seriously. When I spoke about my work, the room grew polite but distant. Someone would change the subject. Someone always did. It wasn't that they disliked me. That would have been easier to understand. I was simply unnecessary. The first time the word inheritance was mentioned openly, it was framed as concern. My father asked if I was planning for the future. He talked about responsibility, about making sure assets were protected. Emily sat quietly, nodding at the right moments. I realized later she already knew more than I did. When I asked how things were structured, my father smiled and said, "You don't need to worry about that." My mother added, "Everything will be fair." Fair was one of those words that sounded comforting until you examined it too closely. As Emily's responsibilities grew, so did my parents' involvement in her life. They attended her corporate events. They boasted to friends about her connections. I learned details about her job from social media posts my mother shared with pride. Meanwhile, my own milestones passed quietly. Promotions, certifications, years of consistent work, none of it seemed to register. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself independence was a strength, but the truth was harder to admit. I still wanted to belong. I still wanted my parents to see me as more than a backup option. That longing was what made the later conversation hurt so deeply. By the time my parents called for a family meeting, I already sensed where it was heading. The tone was too careful, too formal. They didn't ask how I was. They asked when I could come. Sitting at that familiar dining table, I felt like I was 16 again, waiting to be told what I'd done wrong. My father spoke about unity, about how families had to make strategic decisions. My mother watched my face, ready to intervene if my reaction became inconvenient. Emily wasn't smug. That was the hardest part. She looked confident, assured, as if the outcome was already settled. Maybe it was. They explained that Emily's position came with opportunities and risks, that the family needed to stand behind her fully, that resources might need to be reallocated. When I asked what that meant for me, the room went quiet. My father didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply stated facts. If I couldn't support the direction they were taking, they would have to reconsider my place in the family's long-term plans. Legal plans. Financial plans. Disown was never said out loud. It didn't need to be. I remember nodding. I remember choosing my words carefully, not because I agreed, but because I knew resistance would change nothing. In that moment, I understood something with painful clarity. My value had always been conditional, and conditions could be revised. I left that night with a hollow calm, not anger, not shock, just a quiet understanding that the family I had been loyal to had already moved on without me. What none of them realized, what they never bothered to ask, was that I had built a life they didn't control. Not flashy, not loud, but real, and connected in ways they could not yet imagine. For now, I kept that to myself. Emily's success became the family's favorite story to tell. It was repeated with small variations depending on the audience, polished and simplified, until it sounded inevitable. She had always been driven. She had always stood out. She had always been destined for more. My parents spoke as if they had merely recognized the truth early and acted accordingly. At first, I tried to listen without resentment. I told myself this was just how families worked. One child shone more brightly, and the others learned to appreciate the light. But over time, the glow became blinding. Emily's job titles grew longer. Her responsibilities expanded. Every promotion was followed by a dinner reservation or a small celebration at home. My father would ask questions about her projects, nodding thoughtfully as she explained strategies I suspected he didn't fully understand. My mother listened with pride that bordered on reverence. When Emily talked about her office, about deadlines and expectations, my parents leaned in. When I mentioned my own work, the response was a polite pause. Someone would say, "That's nice," and the conversation would drift back to Emily. It wasn't just the attention. It was the assumption underneath it that Emily's path mattered more. I noticed it most clearly when my parents began asking me to help out. Could I be more flexible during holidays? Emily's schedule was demanding. Could I delay my own plans? Emily might need support. Could I keep certain things to myself? Stress wasn't good for her right now. Everything was framed as temporary. Everything was framed as necessary. I started to feel like my life existed on standby, waiting to be paused whenever Emily's needed space to expand. One evening during a visit home, my father asked me if I was satisfied with my career. It sounded like concern, but there was something else underneath it, an evaluation. When I said I was, he frowned slightly, as if I had missed the point of the question. "You know," he said carefully, "Emily's position could open doors for the whole family." I asked what he meant. He waved a hand dismissively. "Connections, influence, stability. It's important we don't jeopardize that." The word jeopardize lingered in the air longer than it should have. Emily didn't look at me. She stared at her plate, calm, composed. I realized then that these conversations had already happened without me. Decisions had already been made. I was being informed, not consulted. Soon after, the comparisons became more explicit. Emily's salary was mentioned in passing, always rounded up, always impressive. Her bonuses were discussed as proof of her indispensability. When my mother talked about finances, it was always in relation to Emily's future, her potential home, her long-term security, the sacrifices that might be required to support her trajectory. When I asked where that left me, my mother smiled softly. "You've always been independent," she said. "You'll be fine." It was meant as reassurance. It felt like dismissal. The pressure increased quietly. My parents suggested I sign certain documents for convenience. They asked me to keep my name off things to avoid complications. Each request was small on its own, but together they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. Emily never asked directly. She didn't have to. My parents acted as intermediaries, smoothing every request, framing every concession as reasonable. One night my father spoke openly about the future of the family's assets. He talked about protecting Emily from risk, about insulating her career from unnecessary distractions. When I asked whether I was included in those plans, he paused. Right now, he said, we need to prioritize where the return is strongest. I understood then that love had been translated into numbers, and I did not rank highly. What hurt most wasn't the money. It was the certainty with which they believed I would accept this arrangement, that I would nod, step back, and disappear into the background without protest. And for a long time, I did exactly that. I stopped sharing details about my life. I let assumptions stand uncorrected. If they believed I was drifting, I didn't argue. If they believed I lacked ambition, I didn't defend myself. Silence became my shield. What they didn't know, what they never asked, was that my career had developed quietly but steadily. I had learned early not to seek validation from them, so I sought competence instead. I built a reputation that didn't rely on family endorsements or social approval. Years earlier, I had worked on a project that required precision, discretion, and trust. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't come with announcements or applause. But it placed me in rooms where decisions were made, and it introduced me to people who valued results over pedigree. Those relationships endured, not because I reminded anyone of them, but because I delivered when it mattered. Emily's boss, though I never referred to him that way in my own mind, was someone I had known long before Emily's name ever appeared on a company roster. Our paths had crossed in a professional context that required mutual respect. He had seen my work when it was inconvenient, uncelebrated, and essential. None of that was visible to my family, and I kept it that way. As Emily's confidence grew, so did her sense of entitlement. She spoke about her company as if it were an extension of herself. She assumed loyalty where none was owed. My parents echoed that confidence, believing proximity to her success made them untouchable. When concerns arose, subtle questions about compliance, about boundaries, my parents dismissed them as envy or misunderstanding. Emily assured them everything was under control. They believed her because they needed to. By then I had learned something crucial: when people are convinced of their own importance, they stop checking their footing. The day my parents finally issued their ultimatum, it felt less like a shock and more like a confirmation. All the careful positioning, all the quiet pressure it had been leading here. Support Emily fully, or lose your place. They expected fear. They expected pleading. They expected compliance. What they didn't expect was my calm. Because by then, I understood something they did not. My worth had never depended on their approval, and the world they were so eager to protect, Emily within already knew exactly who I was. I just hadn't reminded them yet. The ultimatum didn't come in a letter or a raised voice. It came wrapped in concern, delivered over coffee at the same kitchen table where my childhood report cards had once been reviewed like balance sheets. My father spoke first. He always did when the conversation involved control. "We need clarity," he said, folding his hands as if he were about to pray. "This situation with Emily is sensitive. The family has to present a united front." My mother nodded beside him, eyes soft, mouth tight. Emily sat across from me, posture relaxed, phone face down on the table. She didn't look nervous. She looked prepared. I waited. My father continued explaining how Emily's role had expanded, how her company relied on her judgment, how any instability, internal or external, could reflect poorly. He spoke as if he were briefing me on a weather report, something factual and unavoidable. "Your choices," he said carefully, "could complicate things." I asked him to explain. He sighed as though disappointed that I needed clarification. "We can't afford dissent right now. If there's even a perception that the family isn't aligned, it could raise questions. Legal questions. Financial ones." The words were measured, strategic, and unmistakably threatening. My mother reached for her mug, then set it down without drinking. "No one wants this to be difficult," she said. "We just need to know we can count on you." I looked at Emily. She finally met my eyes, offering a small, practiced smile. "This isn't personal," she said. "It's just how things work at this level." At this level. I asked what being counted on meant. My father didn't hesitate. He outlined it plainly. I would need to step back from any claims, formal or informal, regarding future family assets. I would need to refrain from involving myself in matters that touched Emily's career. And if asked, I would publicly support the narrative they had already established. And if I don't, I asked. The silence that followed was heavy, but controlled. My father leaned back in his chair. Then we would have to reconsider your position in the family's long-term planning. Disown still wasn't said. It didn't need to be. I felt something shift inside me, not anger but a quiet recognition. This was the line. Not because of money, but because of what it revealed. They weren't asking for trust. They were demanding erasure. I nodded slowly. Not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. I told them I needed time to think. Emily exhaled, relieved. My mother smiled as if the worst had passed. My father stood signaling the meeting's end. Decisions he believed were already made. I drove away that afternoon with my hands steady on the wheel and my thoughts unusually clear. There was grief, yes, but it was distant, almost academic, like mourning something that had died years ago without announcement. Over the next weeks, the pressure intensified subtly. Emails from my father carefully worded, calls from my mother checking in, reminding me how much stress Emily was under. Messages from Emily herself, light and friendly, each one carrying an unspoken expectation. I responded politely. Briefly. I didn't argue. I didn't refuse outright. Silence, I had learned, made people uneasy. Then came the documents. They were framed as procedural updates to estate planning adjustments for efficiency. My father asked me to review them, emphasizing how routine they were. When I read them carefully, I saw the truth laid bare in legal language. My future claims were being narrowed, redirected, diluted until they barely existed. I told him I would need legal counsel before signing anything. The reaction was immediate. My father's tone sharpened. My mother accused me of distrust. Emily went quiet, which I knew meant she was calculating. Within hours, the narrative shifted. I was being difficult. I was overreacting. I was putting Emily's career at risk. That night, my father called and spoke plainly. If you insist on making this adversarial, he said, we'll have to make some hard decisions. There it was. I thanked him for his honesty and ended the call. I didn't sleep much that night, not from fear, but from the weight of finality. I understood that whatever happened next would permanently alter my place in the family. There would be no returning to the careful balance I had maintained for years. And for the first time, that felt like relief. The next morning, I declined to sign the documents. I explained that I would not relinquish my rights under pressure. I kept my language neutral, professional. The fallout was swift. My parents accused me of betrayal. Emily accused me of selfishness. They framed my refusal as an attack, as evidence that I had always resented her success. They spoke as if my silence over the years had been strategic, manipulative. I listened. I didn't correct them. Within days, my father made it explicit. If I continued down this path, I would no longer be included in the family's legal or financial future. Accounts would be adjusted, trusts revised, access revoked. I asked him if that was his final decision. He said yes. I told him I understood. What he didn't hear in my voice was fear. What he mistook for resignation was resolve. Because while my family believed they were stripping me of leverage, they had overlooked something fundamental. They assumed power flowed only through bloodlines and bank accounts. They believed authority came from titles they could see. They had no idea that the company Emily relied on, her safety net, her source of status, was already paying attention. That questions were already being asked. That the person she answered to was someone who knew me, not as an obstacle, but as a professional whose judgment he trusted. I didn't initiate that scrutiny. I didn't have to. All I did was stop protecting them from the consequences of their own certainty. And as my family closed ranks against me, convinced they had won the groundwork for something far larger was quietly being laid. After my father made his decision final, something inside me settled. The anxiety I had expected never came. Instead, there was a strange, almost unsettling calm, like the quiet after a long illness, when you realize the fever has broken and the damage has already been done. I stopped trying to explain myself. That more than anything seemed to confuse them. For years, I had filled the gaps. I clarified misunderstandings. I softened edges. I carried the emotional labor of keeping everyone comfortable even when I wasn't. Now I let the silence stand. When my mother called, I answered kindly, but briefly. When Emily texted, I responded with polite neutrality. I gave them nothing to argue with and nothing to twist. They mistook that for weakness. What they didn't know, what they had never truly asked about, was how I had spent the last decade building a life that didn't need their approval. My career had never been dramatic. There were no grand announcements, no celebratory dinners. I chose stability over spectacle, competence over charisma. Early on, I learned that being reliable in rooms where things actually happened mattered more than being impressive in rooms where people talked about it. I worked in compliance and strategic operations, one of those roles people rarely notice until something goes wrong. My job was to see patterns others overlooked to anticipate risk before it became scandal. It required discretion, long hours, and a tolerance for being invisible. I was good at it. Years earlier, long before Emily's name ever appeared on a corporate directory, I had been assigned to a high-stakes internal review for a rapidly expanding firm. The company was growing fast, fueled by ambition and confidence. Leadership was brilliant, demanding, and deeply aware of how fragile success could be if the wrong details slipped through. That was where I met Daniel Hartman. He wasn't loud. He didn't posture. He watched. When he spoke, people listened not because he demanded attention, but because his questions exposed weaknesses no one else had considered. At the time, he wasn't a household name, but within the industry, his reputation was solid, someone who built systems that lasted. I worked directly with him for nearly a year. Not as a subordinate, not as a peer, but as a professional whose role intersected with his at critical points. He saw my reports. He challenged my conclusions. I defended them with data documentation and calm persistence. When the project ended, he thanked me. Not casually, specifically. People who do your kind of work rarely get credit, he told me. But I remember who keeps things from falling apart. That was it. No promises, no dramatic send-off, just mutual respect. Over the years, our paths crossed occasionally. Industry events, brief consultations, a few emails asking for perspective. Nothing inappropriate, nothing public. Just a professional familiarity grounded in trust. Emily's company, I later learned, had been one of Hartman's acquisitions. He wasn't her direct manager in the day-to-day sense, but his influence shaped the structure she operated within. His standards were embedded into policies she likely skimmed but never truly absorbed. When Emily got the job, I noticed the connection immediately, and I said nothing. Not out of fear, out of restraint. I understood the power of timing. I also understood that proximity could be dangerous if handled poorly, so I kept my distance. I never mentioned her name. I never referenced the company. I let her success exist independently of my past. My family, meanwhile, built a narrative that excluded me entirely. They spoke as if I were floundering, as if my refusal to participate in their plans was evidence of inadequacy rather than choice. My father told extended relatives that I was going through a phase. My mother suggested I was overwhelmed. Emily said nothing publicly, but I could feel her frustration in the way she avoided me. My silence didn't flatter her story. Then small things began to happen. Emily complained one evening about increased oversight at work, new reporting requirements, unexpected reviews. She brushed it off as bureaucracy, but there was tension beneath her confidence. My parents dismissed it as corporate nonsense. "That's what happens when you rise," my father said proudly. I recognized the signs immediately. Oversight wasn't random. It followed patterns. It appeared when discrepancies emerged, minor at first, then harder to ignore. I didn't know the specifics yet, but I knew the process. I had designed parts of it myself in other contexts. I stayed quiet. Weeks later, Emily's calls grew shorter. Her schedule became erratic. She stopped sharing details altogether. My parents grew defensive, interpreting any question as criticism. The more pressure Emily faced, the more fiercely they protected her, and the more isolated she became. One afternoon, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. It was brief, professional. "Would you be available for a confidential consultation, D. Hartman?" I read it twice before responding. He didn't mention Emily. He didn't mention the company. He didn't need to. We spoke the next day. His tone was measured, but beneath it I sensed concern, not panic, but calculation. He asked general questions, hypotheticals. I answered carefully, staying within ethical boundaries, offering insight without accusation. At one point, he paused. "You wouldn't happen to be related to Emily Carter, would you?" he asked. I told him the truth. There was a long silence on the line. Not shock, not disbelief, just a quiet recalibration. That explains a few things, he said finally. He didn't elaborate. He didn't ask me to intervene. He didn't offer protection or advantage. He thanked me for my time and ended the call. That was all. I didn't tell my family about the conversation. I didn't need to. What mattered was not what was said, but what was now known. From that point on, events moved beyond anyone's personal control. Emily began staying late at the office. She stopped attending family dinners. When she did show up, she was distracted, defensive. My parents oscillated between pride and anxiety, unable to reconcile the image they had built with the tension they could no longer ignore. My father called me one evening, his voice tight. He asked if I knew anything about what was going on with Emily's company. I told him the truth. No, I said. I don't. And in that moment, it was the most honest answer I could give, because whatever was coming next had nothing to do with family dynamics anymore. It was about systems, accountability, and decisions that had been made long before anyone thought to question them. My family had believed they could control outcomes by controlling me. They never considered what might happen once I stopped absorbing the impact for them. The first sign that Emily was losing control came in the form of defensiveness. Not panic yet, but a sharpness that hadn't been there before. She spoke faster, interrupted more, laughed too quickly at things that weren't funny. Confidence, when pushed beyond its limits, has a way of turning brittle. At a family dinner, she barely touched her food. My father filled the silence with reassurance, telling her how proud he was, how these things happened when you were important enough to attract scrutiny. My mother nodded, repeating that success always came with jealousy. Emily didn't contradict them. She let them build that shield around her layer by layer. What they didn't understand was that scrutiny of this kind wasn't emotional. It wasn't personal. It didn't care how proud they were or how much they had sacrificed. It followed evidence, not narratives. Emily's role at the company had expanded beyond what her experience justified. That wasn't unusual in itself. Fast-growing firms often promoted aggressively, but it created vulnerabilities. She had access to sensitive processes. She signed off on contracts that required careful separation of authority. She blurred lines that should have remained clear. At first, she had gotten away with it. The culture around her rewarded decisiveness and speed. People didn't question results as long as numbers looked good. But systems designed by Daniel Hartman didn't rely on trust alone. They relied on patterns, irregular approvals, vendor overlaps, timing discrepancies. None of it dramatic enough to trigger alarms on its own, but together they formed a shape that couldn't be ignored. Once that shape appeared, the process took over. Emily began to complain about new protocols, about being asked to justify decisions that had never been questioned before. She framed it as micromanagement, as a lack of appreciation for her contributions. My parents echoed that language, adopting it as their own. "They're trying to slow her down," my father said during one call. "People get threatened when someone rises too fast." I listened without correcting him. What Emily didn't tell them, what she couldn't tell them, was that the scrutiny wasn't coming from her immediate team. It was coming from above. From people whose names didn't appear in her daily inbox, but whose standards governed everything beneath them. The pressure changed her behavior. She started leaning harder on the family, asking for introductions, asking for favors, asking my father to speak to people he barely knew, convinced that proximity to influence could still override procedure. He tried. It didn't work. She began making small demands of me, too. At first, they were subtle. Questions framed as curiosity. "You've worked in operations, right? Do you think it's normal for them to ask for this much documentation?" I answered carefully, offering general explanations without specifics. Then the tone shifted. One evening she called and asked outright if I knew anyone at the executive level. When I didn't answer immediately, she accused me of withholding support. "After everything we've done for you," she said, "you owe me this." That word "owe" landed heavily. I told her the truth as plainly as I could, without exposing anything. "I can't interfere," I said. "And even if I could, this isn't something influence fixes." She hung up on me. After that, the narrative my family built around me hardened. I was no longer just uncooperative. I was disloyal. My parents suggested that I was secretly enjoying Emily's discomfort. They implied that my refusal to help revealed long-standing resentment. They were wrong about my feelings, but not about one thing: I was no longer protecting them from reality. Emily's behavior at work grew riskier as the pressure mounted. She rushed approvals, delegated improperly, tried to outrun the system instead of respecting it. Each move created another data point, another inconsistency, another reason for the net to tighten. By the time she realized how serious the situation was, it was too late to quietly correct course. She was summoned to meetings without agendas, asked to submit reports retroactively, required to explain decisions made months earlier. The language used was neutral, procedural, but the implications were clear. My parents oscillated between denial and rage. They blamed internal politics. They blamed competitors. They blamed me. My father called one night, his voice sharp with accusation. "You could fix this," he said. "I know you could. And you're choosing not to." I told him something I had never said aloud before. "This isn't about me," I said. And it never was. He hung up on me, furious. The breaking point came when Emily was informed of a formal internal review. Not a casual audit, not a routine check. A structured investigation with defined scope and external oversight. She didn't tell my parents right away. When she finally did, she framed it as a misunderstanding that would be resolved quickly. My parents clung to that explanation, repeating it like a mantra. But I recognized the language. I recognized the timelines. Formal reviews don't exist to reassure. They exist to conclude. Emily grew erratic. She stopped sleeping. She snapped at my mother. She avoided my father. The confidence that had once insulated her now worked against her, making every defensive response feel like confirmation rather than denial. One afternoon, I received another email from Daniel Hartman. No greeting. No context. "We're moving forward." That was all. I sat with that sentence for a long time. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel relieved. What I felt was a deep, steady sadness for the years my family had spent believing that proximity to power was the same as understanding it. Emily still believed she could talk her way out. That charm and certainty would override documentation. She underestimated how little her intentions mattered once evidence took center stage. When the request for a public-facing meeting arrived, a board-level session with compliance present, my parents finally understood that this was bigger than family dynamics. They called me in a panic. "What do we do?" my mother asked, her voice breaking. For the first time, they weren't issuing demands. They were asking. I answered honestly. "You wait," I said, "and you listen." They didn't like that answer. But there were no others left. Emily entered that meeting believing she could still control the outcome. She wore confidence like armor, unaware that the room she was walking into no longer cared about appearances. And as my family braced themselves for what they still hoped would be a misunderstanding, the truth, documented, measured, and undeniable, was preparing to speak for itself. The days leading up to the board meeting felt stretched and unreal, like time itself had slowed to watch what would happen next. Emily moved through them with a forced efficiency that fooled no one who knew her well. She checked her phone constantly. She stopped making eye contact. The confidence she wore now was rigid, brittle, as if one unexpected question could shatter it. My parents hovered. My mother tried to soothe Emily with reassurance she no longer believed. My father paced, making calls that went unanswered, leaving voicemails that were never returned. For the first time in my life, I saw him uncertain, his authority useless in a world that didn't recognize it. They still tried to pull me back into the center of things. My father asked me to come home the weekend before the meeting. He said it was important we stand together. The words sounded familiar, but the tone had changed. This wasn't strategy anymore. It was fear. I went. The house felt smaller than I remembered. The same furniture, the same photographs on the walls, but something essential had shifted. The illusion of control that once filled every room had thinned, leaving only tension behind. We sat in the living room, no one turning on the television. Emily spoke first. "They're blowing this out of proportion," she said, staring at a spot on the carpet. "It's procedural. Once I explain, it'll settle down." My father nodded too quickly. "Exactly. These people don't understand how hard you've worked." I waited. Emily finally looked at me. Her expression hardened. "You've been quiet," she said. "You always are. But now it matters." I asked her what she wanted from me. She hesitated, then said it plainly. "I need you to confirm something if they ask. Just contextualize a few decisions. You understand how these things work." There it was. Not advice, not support, participation. I felt the weight of that request settle heavily in my chest. For years, I had absorbed blame-adjusted expectations, erased myself to preserve peace. This was different. This wasn't about feelings or family harmony. This was about truth versus convenience. I can't do that, I said. Emily's eyes flashed. Why not? Because it wouldn't be accurate, I replied. And because it wouldn't help you. My father's voice cut in sharply. You're choosing a terrible moment to take a moral stand. I met his gaze. This isn't a moral stand. It's a legal one. The room went silent. My mother looked between us, panic flickering across her face. Please, she said softly. Can't we just get through this first? Then we can talk about everything else. I shook my head. That's how we got here. Emily stood abruptly. You've always resented me, she said. This is just your way of finally getting even. The accusation stung not because it was true, but because it was easier for her to believe that than to accept the reality forming around her. I don't want you to fail, I said quietly. But I won't lie to stop it. That was the moment something broke. My father's face hardened into something I recognized all too well, the expression he wore when he decided someone was no longer worth understanding. If you don't support your sister, he said, then don't expect to be part of this family anymore. There it was, not implied, not dressed up, spoken. I nodded slowly. I understand. Emily laughed, sharp and humorless. Unbelievable, she said. After everything we've done for you. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The meeting ended abruptly after that. I left the house before dinner, before apologies could be demanded or conditions renegotiated. As I drove away, I felt a deep, aching sadness, but also a strange clarity. They had finally said what had always been true. Over the next few days, communication dwindled. Emily stopped calling altogether. My mother sent brief messages filled with worry and guilt. My father said nothing. Then the morning of the board meeting arrived. It wasn't held in a courtroom, but it carried the same weight. A conference room high above the city, glass walls, long table, neutral lighting, compliance officers present, legal counsel seated quietly, executives reviewing documents with practiced detachment. Emily walked in, believing this was still a conversation she could manage. I wasn't in the room, but I didn't need to be. I knew the structure. I knew the order. Presentation of findings, opportunity for response, questions, deliberation. Facts don't rush. They wait. Later, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It's worse than she thought. That was all. My mother called an hour later, her voice shaking. They're asking about things from years ago, she said. They have paperwork, emails. I closed my eyes. I could picture it exactly. The slow unveiling. The way each answer created more questions instead of resolving them. Emily called that evening. She didn't yell. She didn't accuse. She cried. They're saying I misrepresented approvals, she said, her voice breaking. They're saying I overstepped. I didn't mean to. I was just trying to keep things moving. I listened. I didn't interrupt. They asked if I had help, she continued. If anyone influenced decisions. I told them no. I felt a quiet relief at that. At least she hadn't crossed that line. They're scheduling another session, she whispered. Public this time. With the board. I knew what that meant. Once things went public, control disappeared completely. Reputation followed documentation. Outcomes followed evidence. After the call ended, I sat alone in my apartment, the city lights blinking steadily outside my window. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. This was the cost of years of imbalance finally correcting itself. My family had believed that unity meant silence, that loyalty meant compliance. They had mistaken my endurance for permission. Now, as Emily faced the consequences of decisions made under pressure and entitlement, they were learning what I had known all along. Silence doesn't protect wrongdoing. It only delays the moment when the truth speaks without you. And when it does, no one gets to negotiate the terms. The second meeting was scheduled for the following week, and this time no one pretended it was routine. Emily didn't come home between sessions. She stayed in a hotel near the office, claiming it was more practical, but I knew the real reason. Distance gave her the illusion of control. It allowed her to think without my parents' anxious presence pressing in on her, without the weight of their expectations crowding every decision. My parents, on the other hand, unraveled. My mother called me twice a day, her voice wavering between denial and desperation. She asked questions she had never asked before about compliance reviews, about how companies handled internal investigations, about what public-facing really meant. I answered carefully, not evasively but truthfully. It means transparency, I said during one call. It means whatever they've found will be presented in a setting where it can't be quietly dismissed. She was silent for a long moment. And Emily, she asked. What happens to her? That depends on the findings, I replied, and on what she does next. My father didn't call. When he finally did 2 days before the meeting, his voice was tight, stripped of its usual authority. Did you know this would happen? He asked. I considered the question. I knew it was possible, I said. Because I've seen this process before. You could have warned us, he said sharply. I did, I replied. Just not in the way you wanted. That ended the conversation. The morning of the board session arrived gray and cold, the kind of day that feels suspended between seasons. I didn't attend. I wasn't invited, and even if I had been, I wouldn't have gone. This wasn't my reckoning to witness. My role had already been played. But Daniel Hartman was there. He didn't sit at the head of the table. He didn't need to. His presence alone changed the temperature of the room. When he spoke, it was with deliberate restraint, the kind that signaled seriousness without spectacle. Emily walked in, expecting to defend herself. She had prepared explanations, narratives that framed her actions as necessary, well-intentioned, misunderstood. She believed context could still save her. What she encountered instead was structure. Emails printed and time-stamped. Contracts cross-referenced. Approval chains diagrammed clearly enough that even a casual observer could see where lines had been crossed. Each piece of evidence was introduced calmly, without accusation, without emotion. When Emily responded, her words sounded increasingly hollow. She spoke of pressure, of expectations, of moving fast in an environment that rewarded decisiveness. She spoke as if intent could outweigh outcome. Hartman listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he asked a single question. Were you authorized to make those decisions independently? Emily hesitated. That hesitation was everything. The legal counsel stepped in after that. Not aggressively, methodically. Clarifying language, narrowing interpretations, removing ambiguity. The meeting stretched on heavy, with unspoken conclusions. By the time it ended, nothing had been decided publicly, but everything had been understood. My parents learned the details later that evening, delivered in fragments through tearful phone calls and broken sentences. The investigation had expanded. External auditors were involved. Emily had been placed on administrative leave pending final review. Leave. Not a suspension. Not a termination. Yet. My mother clung to that distinction, repeating it like a lifeline. They haven't fired her, she said. That has to mean something. It means they're being careful, I replied. The following days were brutal. News traveled quickly inside the company, and then beyond it. Nothing official was released, but speculation filled the gaps. Emily stopped answering calls. My parents oscillated between anger and shame, unsure who to blame, now that the narrative they had relied on was collapsing. And then Daniel Hartman reached out again. This time he asked to meet in person. We chose a quiet cafe near his office. No corporate setting, no audience, just two professionals sitting across from each other. I won't involve you directly, he said after we ordered. I want to be clear about that. I understand, I replied. He studied me for a moment. Your sister put herself in a difficult position, he continued. But what concerns me more is the environment that allowed it to happen. I nodded. Systems fail when people stop respecting them. Exactly, he said. And when families confuse influence with immunity. The word landed heavily. He didn't ask me to testify. He didn't ask me to provide documents. He didn't ask me to do anything that would compromise my integrity. What he did ask was simpler and harder. If questions come up about your relationship to Emily, he said, I need honesty. Not advocacy, not defense, just accuracy. You'll have it, I said. That was enough. The final hearing was scheduled for the following week. This one would be fully public within the company board members, senior leadership compliance officers, legal representatives. Decisions would be recorded. Outcomes documented. My parents called me the night before. They didn't threaten. They didn't bargain. They apologized. Not fully, not cleanly, but enough to reveal that the ground beneath them had finally shifted. My father admitted he had underestimated the seriousness of the situation. My mother said she wished she had listened sooner. Emily didn't call. The next day, the decision was made. Emily was terminated for cause. The findings cited repeated violations of internal controls, misrepresentation of authority, and failure to disclose conflicts of process. Legal action was recommended, though not immediately pursued. Her career ended not with a dramatic scandal, but with a carefully worded report that would follow her wherever she went. When the news reached my parents, they were silent. In the days that followed, something unexpected happened. They stopped talking about money. They stopped talking about inheritance. They stopped talking about fairness as a concept to be negotiated. For the first time, they spoke about consequences. Emily withdrew completely. She blamed the system. She blamed the company. She blamed everyone except herself. I let her. This was a reckoning she had to face alone. And as the dust settled, one truth became impossible to ignore. The family I had been asked to sacrifice myself for had been built on assumptions. Assumptions about power, about control, about who mattered. Those assumptions had finally been tested, and they had not survived. The aftermath didn't explode the way people imagine these things do. There were no headlines, no public apologies, no dramatic walkouts. Instead, there was a slow, suffocating quiet, the kind that settles after a structure collapses inward rather than outward. Emily's termination became an unspoken fact. Everyone knew. No one discussed it openly. Within the industry, her name began to carry a weight it hadn't before. Recruiters stopped calling. Messages went unanswered. Doors that had once opened easily now remained firmly closed. My parents struggled to understand this kind of consequence. They kept waiting for the moment when Emily could explain herself to the right person. The moment when context would matter again. The moment when someone would acknowledge how unfair all of this was. That moment never came. Instead, paperwork arrived. Letters from attorneys outlining next steps. Notices regarding internal findings. Carefully worded communications that emphasized process, not emotion. Each document stripped another layer of illusion away. Emily moved back home temporarily, not because she wanted to, but because she had nowhere else to go. Seeing her like that, deflated, angry, unmoored, was harder than I expected. Not because I felt guilty, but because I recognized the cost of believing your own story for too long. She had built her identity around momentum. Without it, she didn't know who she was. My parents tried to reassert control. They talked about damage control, about leveraging remaining connections, about legal strategies that might soften the blow. They spoke as if this were still a negotiation. It wasn't. The company's final report was thorough and unyielding. It didn't accuse Emily of malice. It didn't speculate about intent. It simply laid out facts, timelines, approvals, and deviations. It concluded that trust had been broken beyond repair. That language mattered more than blame ever could. Emily read the report in silence, her face unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat. "They already decided," she said. "Yes," I replied quietly. "Long before the final meeting." She looked at me then, not with anger, but with something closer to confusion. "Why didn't you stop this?" The question wasn't accusatory. It was bewildered. "Because I couldn't," I said, "and because it wasn't mine to stop." She didn't argue. She simply looked away. That was when my parents finally began to understand the scale of what had happened. Not just to Emily's career, but to the version of the future they had constructed around her. The investments they had made, emotional, financial, strategic, were suddenly meaningless. They turned their attention to me in a way that felt unfamiliar. Cautious, observant. My father asked questions about my work genuinely this time. Not as an evaluation, but as an attempt to understand. My mother asked how long I had known things were serious. I didn't know specifics, I told her, but I understood the process. "You could have warned us," she said again, softer this time. "I did," I replied. "You just didn't hear it as a warning." Weeks passed. Emily's legal counsel advised against public statements. She withdrew from social circles. Friends distanced themselves quietly. Invitations stopped coming. The isolation was total. And then something else surfaced. During the investigation, questions had been raised about certain financial decisions Emily had made that extended beyond internal policy violations. Nothing criminal yet, but enough to warrant further review. Regulatory bodies requested clarification. External auditors requested documentation. The net widened. My parents panicked. They worried about reputational damage, about potential liability, about how far this could go. For the first time, they stopped asking how to protect Emily's image and started asking how to protect themselves. My father sat me down one evening and spoke with a humility I had never heard from him. "We made mistakes," he said. "With both of you." I waited. "We pushed too hard," he continued. "We assumed we knew what was best. Yes, I said. He swallowed. We didn't see you. The words landed heavily. That acknowledgement didn't fix anything. It didn't erase years of imbalance or restore trust overnight. But it did something quieter and more important. It ended the denial. Emily watched this shift from a distance. She didn't join the conversations. She didn't seek reconciliation. Her focus was elsewhere, on salvaging what little remained of her professional identity, on finding a narrative that would allow her to move forward without confronting everything she had lost. One afternoon, she approached me alone. I thought you were weak, she said abruptly. I thought you just didn't have what it takes. I didn't respond. You never fought, she continued. You never pushed back. I thought that meant you couldn't. She laughed softly without humor. Turns out you just didn't need to. There was no apology in her voice, just recognition. I hope you figure out what comes next, I said. She nodded once and walked away. As for me, my life continued with surprising steadiness. My work remained demanding but grounded. Colleagues treated me no differently, which was exactly how I wanted it. Daniel Hartman never mentioned Emily again. Our professional relationship remained intact, respectful, appropriately distant. The family dynamic shifted slowly, awkwardly. My parents stopped issuing ultimatums. They stopped assuming my compliance. They began asking instead of instructing. It felt strange, too late perhaps, but real. One evening my mother asked if I resented them. I considered the question carefully. I did, I said, for a long time. And now, she asked. Now I understand you, I replied. That doesn't mean I excuse everything, but it means I don't need to carry it anymore. That was the beginning of something different. Not forgiveness in the dramatic sense. Not reconciliation wrapped in sentimentality. Just a recalibration. Emily eventually moved out. She found work far from her previous field under a different title with none of the authority she once commanded. It was honest work. Humbling work. I hoped it would teach her what success without insulation feels like. The inheritance conversation never returned to its previous form. Legal documents were revised again, this time with transparency. My parents consulted me instead of dictating terms. The power dynamic they had relied on no longer functioned. They had seen what unchecked confidence could destroy, and they had seen what quiet competence could withstand. The family I had once feared losing had already transformed into something else entirely. Less impressive, less certain, but perhaps more honest. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was standing in someone else's shadow. I was standing on my own ground. The public reckoning didn't happen in a courtroom, but it carried the same gravity. The company scheduled a full town hall disclosure mandatory for senior leadership, compliance, legal, and department heads. Attendance wasn't optional. Records would be kept. Questions would be logged. Decisions would be explained, not debated. This was how institutions closed chapters. Emily didn't attend in person. Her attorney advised against it. Instead, she watched from a secure video link, her image reduced to a small square on a screen mounted at the far end of the room. I wasn't there either, but the details reached me later with unsettling clarity. Daniel Hartman opened the session. He didn't mention Emily by name at first. He spoke about responsibility, about systems designed to protect not just the company, but the people who depended on it, employees, partners, clients. He spoke calmly, deliberately, as if teaching rather than condemning. Then the findings were presented. A senior compliance officer walked through the timeline. Slides displayed approval chains, highlighted deviations, and cross-referenced policies. Each decision Emily had made outside her authority was shown not as an isolated misstep, but as part of a pattern. The room was quiet. When the officer finished, legal counsel summarized the conclusion. The termination for cause had been upheld. Further regulatory cooperation was ongoing. Internal controls were being reinforced. No one argued. Questions followed, not emotional ones, but procedural. How had oversight failed? What safeguards would be implemented? How would accountability be ensured going forward? Emily's attorney was given the opportunity to speak. He argued mitigation, pressure, rapid growth, ambiguous authority. Hartman listened, then responded with a single sentence. Ambiguity is not permission. That was the end of it. After the session, an internal memo was released, carefully worded, precise. It didn't sensationalize. It didn't speculate. It stated facts and reaffirmed standards. Within hours, the narrative shifted from scandal to lesson. And that was that. When my parents heard the full account, something finally gave way. My father sat at the kitchen table for a long time without speaking. The man who had once believed he could negotiate reality now stared at the consequences of years spent confusing control with wisdom. My mother cried not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet grief that surprised me. She wasn't crying for Emily's job. She was crying for the certainty she had built her life around. Emily, meanwhile, withdrew completely. She stopped blaming the company. She stopped blaming me. What replaced her anger was something more unsettling: emptiness. The confidence that had once defined her had nowhere to go. One night, weeks after the town hall, she knocked on my door. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, but internally, like someone who had lost the structure that held them upright. "I watched the recording," she said without preamble. I nodded. "They weren't cruel," she continued. "That almost made it worse." I didn't respond. "They didn't care who I was," she said quietly. "Only what I did." "Yes," I said. "That's how it works." She sat down heavily on the couch, staring at her hands. I thought if I stayed confident, if I acted like I belonged there, it would be enough. For a while, I replied. "It was." She looked up at me then, something raw in her eyes. "You knew this would happen." "I knew it could," I said. "I didn't know when." She laughed softly. "You always knew more than you let on." "I knew how systems respond to pressure," I said. "That's not the same as wanting this outcome." She nodded slowly. "I don't know who I am without all of that," she admitted. "That's the hardest part," I said. "But it's also the most honest place to start." She left shortly after, quieter than when she arrived. The fallout continued in smaller ways. Emily's professional network dissolved. Friends who had orbited her success drifted away. Invitations stopped. Calls went unanswered. She took a job outside her field under a supervisor younger than her, earning a fraction of what she once had. My parents struggled to adjust. They had to confront the uncomfortable truth that their favoritism hadn't protected Emily. It had insulated her from learning restraint. And that their dismissal of me hadn't diminished my worth, it had simply blinded them to it. They tried awkwardly to repair things. My father apologized one evening, not for the ultimatum, but for assuming silence meant agreement. "I thought if you weren't fighting," he said, "it meant you didn't care." "I cared," I replied. "I just didn't need to prove it the way you expected." My mother asked if I could forgive them. "I can move forward," I said. "That's not the same thing." They accepted that. The family dynamic changed permanently. There were no more threats, no more leverage disguised as concern. Decisions were discussed, not imposed. The inheritance conversation, once a weapon, became a transparent process handled by attorneys, not emotions. Power shifted quietly. As for me, the strangest part was how little my life changed. I still went to work, still met deadlines, still operated in the background where outcomes mattered more than recognition. The difference was internal. I no longer carried the weight of needing to be seen by people who had never learned how to look. Daniel Hartman sent a brief note a month later. "Thank you for your integrity." That was all. I didn't frame it. I didn't share it. I read it once and let it go. Because the victory I had never sought wasn't about acknowledgement. It was about standing still while the truth did the work for me. My family had threatened to erase me for her benefit. They had assumed I had nothing of my own. What they learned too late to undo was that the quietest people often have the strongest footing. And when systems finally speak, they don't ask who you are related to. They ask what you've done. After the town hall, life didn't snap back into place. It settled slowly, unevenly, like dust after a long demolition. The structure that had once defined our family was gone, and what remained felt exposed, unfamiliar. Emily moved out of my parents' house quietly. There was no announcement, no family meeting. One weekend, her car was gone, and her room stood half empty, the walls stripped of framed certificates and glossy reminders of who she had been. My mother wandered in and out of that room for days, straightening what no longer belonged there. Emily didn't tell us where she went at first. Later, I learned she had taken a short-term lease an hour away closer to her new job. The title was modest. The salary was less than a third of what she once earned. She worked under someone else's procedures, now someone else's scrutiny. There were no shortcuts, no favors. For the first time, she had to perform without insulation. My parents struggled more than she did. They had built their sense of purpose around managing outcomes, guiding, steering, deciding. Now there was nothing left to manage. The consequences had already landed, and no amount of strategy could rewrite them. My father stopped talking about what should have happened. He focused instead on logistics. on paperwork, on the mechanics of daily life. He filled his days with tasks as if motion itself could substitute for certainty. My mother grew quieter. She stopped explaining things away. When friends asked about Emily, she offered vague answers and changed the subject. The pride she once wore so openly had been replaced by something closer to humility. One evening she asked me to walk with her after dinner. We took the familiar route through the neighborhood past houses that looked just like ours, controlled, composed, unaware. "I used to think fairness meant balance," she said suddenly. "One child succeeds, the other adapts." I didn't respond. "I see now how wrong that was," she continued. "Adaptation isn't the same as choice." "No," I said. "It isn't." She stopped walking. "Do you think we broke something that can't be fixed?" I thought about that for a long time. "I think some things don't go back to how they were," I said. "But that doesn't mean nothing new can grow." She nodded slowly, accepting the answer for what it was. Emily and I spoke occasionally, but our conversations were different now. There was no competition in them, no comparison. She didn't ask for help, and I didn't offer advice she hadn't requested. What existed between us was cautious honesty. One afternoon she called me from her break room. "I messed up today," she said flatly. "Missed a deadline." "What happened?" I asked. "I overestimated how much control I had," she replied. "Old habit." I smiled to myself. "That's a hard one to unlearn." She was quiet for a moment. "You never did that," she said. "Did you? I couldn't afford to," I replied. There was no bitterness in her voice when she said, "I see that now." That acknowledgement didn't heal everything. But it shifted something fundamental. For the first time, we were speaking as equals, not because our lives looked the same, but because neither of us was pretending anymore. My parents finalized their legal arrangements a few months later. This time there were no closed-door meetings, no ultimatums disguised as concern. Everything was documented, transparent, reviewed by independent counsel. They asked for my input, not as an obligation but as respect. I gave it where I could. The inheritance, once wielded like leverage, became just another administrative reality. Stripped of emotional weight, it lost its power to threaten or reward. That alone felt like a victory. At work, nothing dramatic happened. No promotions tied to the fallout. No whispers of recognition. And that suited me perfectly. What did change was my sense of presence. I stopped shrinking myself in conversations. I stopped assuming my perspective needed justification. I spoke when it mattered, and I stayed silent when it didn't. People noticed not because I demanded attention, but because I no longer deflected it. Daniel Hartman and I crossed paths at an industry conference months later. We exchanged a brief greeting, nothing more. No mention of the past, no acknowledgement required. Professional respect doesn't need rehearsal. As the year moved on, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't waiting for closure anymore. There was no dramatic apology coming. No moment where everyone gathered to acknowledge the truth in unison. What there was instead was a series of small, quiet corrections. Adjustments in tone, in behavior, in expectation. That was enough. One night, my father asked if I regretted not fighting harder earlier, not confronting them sooner, not forcing recognition. I considered the question carefully. "No," I said. "Because if I had fought the way you wanted, you would have dismissed it. You needed to see the system respond, not me." He nodded slowly. I didn't realize how much weight silence could carry. "Silence only works," I said, "when it's backed by truth." Emily joined us later that evening, visiting briefly after work. She looked tired but grounded, less polished, more real. She listened as my parents spoke, no longer interrupting or steering the conversation. Before she left, she turned to me. "I used to think winning meant being untouchable," she said. "Now I think it means being able to stand when things fall apart." I met her gaze. "That's closer." As I watched her walk out the door, I felt something loosen inside me. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Release. The threat that had once hung over me, disownment, erasure, conditional love, had lost its power the moment I stopped organizing my life around it. My family had learned painfully that control doesn't equal security, that favoritism doesn't guarantee success, and that the people who don't demand recognition are often the ones who can withstand the longest storms. I didn't win by speaking louder. I didn't win by proving anyone wrong. I won by staying where I was, letting the truth do what it always does when given time and structure. It reveals. By the time a full year had passed, the story no longer felt like something that was happening to us. It felt like something that had already happened and left its mark. Emily settled into her new routine with a kind of quiet discipline that surprised me. She woke early, commuted longer than she used to, answered to people who didn't care about her last name or past titles. No one treated her gently. No one treated her harshly either. She was evaluated the way most people are by consistency, accuracy, and results. Some days, she hated it. Some days she seemed almost grateful. She stopped dressing the way she once had. The tailored confidence was gone, replaced by something simpler. When she spoke now, she listened for responses instead of assuming them. I watched her learn slowly, painfully, that authority isn't something you carry with you forever. It's something you earn again every day. My parents changed too, though, in less obvious ways. My father stopped trying to manage people. He focused on himself, his health, his routines, his long-neglected friendships. Without the illusion of control, he seemed smaller at first, then steadier. He learned to ask questions instead of issuing instructions. When he didn't understand something, he admitted it. That alone rewrote decades of family dynamics. My mother became more introspective. She read. She volunteered. She stopped narrating our lives to others as if they were case studies in success. When people asked about her children, she spoke more carefully now, less defensively. "She's finding her footing," she said of Emily once. And the other someone asked. My mother smiled softly. She always had. That was the closest thing to validation I had ever received from her. As for me, the distance I had once created out of necessity became something else entirely. It was no longer a wall. It was space, healthy, deliberate, chosen. I visited when I wanted to. I stayed when it felt right. I left without guilt. No one questioned it anymore. The threat of disownment, once so heavy it felt inevitable, now seemed almost absurd. Not because it had never been real, but because it no longer mattered. I had outgrown the fear that gave it power. One evening, months after everything had settled, we sat together at the same dining table where the ultimatum had once been delivered. No documents. No tension. Just dinner. My father cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology," he said, looking directly at me. I waited. "Not for the outcome," he continued, "but for assuming your silence meant weakness. I thought if you weren't pushing, you had nothing to push with." I nodded. "You weren't wrong to think silence was a choice," I said. "You were wrong about why I chose it." He accepted that. Emily spoke next, her voice measured. "I thought success made me untouchable," she said. "And I thought you just didn't want it badly enough." I met her eyes. "I wanted stability," I replied. "And freedom." She nodded. "I see the difference now." There was no dramatic reconciliation, no tearful embrace. Just a shared understanding that the story we had lived inside for so long was finally over. Later that night, as I drove home, I thought about everything that had unfolded, not just the events, but the pattern behind them. How easily families confuse love with control. How often silence is misread as consent. How quickly power exposes the difference between confidence and competence. I hadn't won anything in the traditional sense. I didn't reclaim status. I didn't reverse the past. I didn't receive public acknowledgement. What I gained was something quieter and far more durable. I gained the ability to stand without permission. The job I had built, the reputation I had earned, the restraint I had practiced, none of it had been visible to my family when it mattered most. And yet when the systems they trusted finally spoke, those unseen foundations were the only things that held. That was the irony they never expected. They threatened to erase me for her benefit, believing I had nothing of my own. They never realized I had already stepped beyond the reach of their threats. Justice didn't arrive as revenge. It arrived as consequence. Measured, documented, inevitable. And when it didn't ask me to speak louder. It asked me to stand still. Now when I think back on that moment, the calm voices, the carefully worded threat, I don't feel anger, I feel clarity. Because the person they tried to corner no longer exists. In her place stands someone who knows this truth. You don't need to fight to prove your worth. You don't need approval to be legitimate. And you don't need to be chosen to stand tall. Sometimes the strongest position is the one you've already built quietly, while everyone else was too busy underestimating you. If there's one lesson this story left me with, it's this. Being overlooked can hurt, but it can also free you. Free you from performing, from begging, from shaping yourself to fit someone else's expectations. When you stop chasing recognition, you start building resilience. When you stop explaining yourself, the truth has room to speak. If this story made you reflect on your own family, your own silences, or the moments you chose endurance over confrontation, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share what stood out to you in the comments. And if you believe quiet strength deserves a place to be heard, consider subscribing. You're always welcome here.